The clang of the piano keys rang like a death knell, sharp and unyielding in the cramped restaurant. It felt as though the room itself was holding its breath. The diner, once bustling with the hum of conversation and the clinking of dishes, had fallen silent. All eyes were on me. I hadn't planned on playing the piano. I wasn't even supposed to be in this position, seated at the cracked, weathered grand piano in the corner of the dimly lit room. My fingers twitched with an anxiety I couldn't suppress, betraying me. This wasn't a game. The man sitting at the bar, the one who had cornered me, his eyes full of contempt and dark amusement, was not just any regular customer. He was rich, dangerous, and I was a waitress. "Play something," he'd said, leaning back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. His voice had been casual, but there was an edge beneath it, like he wasn't asking, but demanding. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I didn't let it show. I had to maintain control. I knew my role here. Keep my head down, serve the drinks, and get through the shift. But this was different. This felt personal. And deep down, I knew something wasn't right. He wasn't here to enjoy dinner. He was here to mock me. I could see it in the way his eyes narrowed at my every movement. I had worked this job long enough to know when a customer was trying to make a spectacle of you. "Go on, impress us," he sneered, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The low hum of the room seemed to grow louder, the air thick with an unspoken tension. My fingers hovered over the keys, the cool ivory smooth beneath my touch. But I hesitated. He knew what I was capable of. He had seen me playing earlier, during my break, before I'd gone back to serving. I hadn't realized anyone was watching, but now I could feel it. The weight of his gaze, cold and calculating. If I played, he'd laugh, mock me. Everyone would join in. But if I didn't, if I refused, I risked losing my job. And right now, my job was the only thing keeping me afloat. I glanced over at the bartender who had watched the scene unfold in silence. His face was a mask, but I could see the unease flickering behind his eyes. He knew what this man was capable of. "You want to see something?" I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. He grinned, leaning forward. "Yes, I think I'll enjoy this." It was a challenge, a taunt, and I knew it. He wasn't asking for a performance. He wasn't interested in art. He wanted to make me the punchline of his joke. And the worst part, I was falling into it. I took a deep breath and let my fingers fall into place on the keys. The room seemed to exhale with me, the air clearing just enough for me to focus. The first notes came slowly, deliberately, a melody I hadn't played in years, one that felt like a memory buried deep inside me, forgotten yet familiar. I wasn't sure how I was still playing, how I was still moving my hands with such precision, even though my chest felt like it was tightening with each note. But the music, it made sense. It was the only thing I had control over, the one thing in this entire mess that made sense. And then I heard it, the sound of his laugh. At first it was quiet, low, almost a chuckle. But then it grew. His laugh filled the space between the notes, cruel and condescending. He didn't even bother to hide it. I kept playing. I couldn't stop. The rhythm built, and so did the tension in the air. With every stroke of the keys, I pushed myself further into the melody. I had no choice. I had to drown out his mockery. I had to show him, show everyone, that this was more than a game. And then he stopped laughing. I felt it, the sudden shift, the change in the room's energy. The silence was deafening. The eyes that had once burned with scorn were now fixed on me, their expressions unreadable. I could feel the shift in him too, the slight tension in his shoulders as he straightened in his seat, his glass now forgotten on the bar. I didn't let up. The music rose, climbing higher and higher, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the entire world outside of that piano melted away. It was just me and the keys, nothing more, nothing less. When the last note lingered in the air, I slowly, almost reluctantly, lifted my hands. The room was still. The man at the bar wasn't smiling anymore. His lips were pressed tight, his jaw clenched. He stood slowly, his face unreadable. For a moment I thought maybe he was about to say something, maybe even apologize. But he didn't. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked out. I sat there, my hands frozen above the piano, unsure of what had just happened. My heart was still racing, my breath shallow. There was no applause, no praise. The tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it dissipated. The room resumed its normal hum, but something had shifted. The bartender gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. I could feel his eyes on me as I stood and walked back to my station. But it wasn't over. I knew that much. I didn't know who that man was, who he really was, but I knew this wasn't the last time our paths would cross. And whatever it was he had seen in me, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few days bled together like the dull hum of the restaurant's fluorescent lights. I should have felt relief after the piano incident, but I didn't. Instead, a gnawing discomfort took root in me, as if something had shifted, but I couldn't quite figure out what. I kept replaying that night in my head, trying to make sense of his eyes. Cold, distant, like he was measuring me, calculating something I wasn't privy to. It was as if I had been a part of some experiment, and I was the only one who hadn't gotten the memo about the rules. It had been 2 days since the man walked out, and I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I saw a man in a suit, I wondered if it was him, if I had been watched before, maybe even studied. The paranoia gnawed at me, scraping the edges of my mind. But more than anything, I wondered why. Why me? I told myself I was being dramatic, that it was just a guy trying to get some amusement out of a lowly waitress, another bored rich person who found joy in making people squirm. But that didn't explain the chill I felt every time I passed the piano, or how, despite everything, I still remembered every detail of that moment. The sound of his footsteps, the way he looked at me after the music ended, the hollow silence that had followed his exit. I tried to push it out of my mind. I had other things to focus on, bills to pay, rent to make, shifts to survive. But the nagging feeling stuck to me, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. That night, I was closing up the restaurant with Carla, the other waitress who'd been working that evening. She'd seen the whole scene unfold, but she hadn't said a word about it since. "So, what was that all about?" I asked as I wiped down the last of the tables. Carla glanced up from her task, her face impassive, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "You know, the guy at the bar, the one who had me play." She gave a half shrug, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't know, just another rich asshole, I guess." "Just another?" I asked, frowning. Carla's eyes darted toward the kitchen door, and she quickly lowered her voice. "Look, I don't know much, but he's not just anyone. Some of the regulars in here have mentioned him. I'm guessing you haven't heard?" I set the rag down, giving her my full attention. "He's... who? What do you mean?" Carla looked around, making sure no one was close. The low hum of the refrigerator was the only sound between us. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They say he's got connections. Powerful ones. The kind that can change things, you know?" I didn't say anything. My mind was already racing, spinning with possibilities. Was it him? The man who had made me play, who had stared at me like he was seeing through me? A connection to power, to something bigger than I could comprehend. It sounded ridiculous, but the way Carla was talking, it didn't seem like it was some urban legend. She knew something. "You need to be careful," Carla added. Her eyes were wide, almost desperate. "These guys, they don't just play games, they get what they want. And when they don't, well, they make sure it's your problem." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Her words had a finality to them, a sense of warning that I couldn't ignore. But what did it mean? What was I supposed to do with this new information? I wanted to ask more, to press her for answers, but I didn't. My gut told me something wasn't right about this whole situation. And now, with Carla's cryptic warning hanging in the air, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stumbled into something I wasn't ready for. The following morning, I couldn't shake the dread that crept up on me like an unwelcome guest. I had a few hours before my shift started, so I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I kept thinking about the man, about his cold smile and the way his laughter had faded as he left. He had left too, suddenly. If he was just toying with me, mocking me for his amusement, why hadn't he come back? Why hadn't he made more of an effort to finish what he started? The answers felt like they were just out of reach, like an elusive dream. I tried to force myself to focus on other things. On the cold wind brushing against my face as I stepped out of the building, on the soft crunch of gravel beneath my shoes. But nothing worked. The unease clung to me. As I passed a small corner store, something caught my eye. An unfamiliar car parked outside. I glanced at it, noting the sleek black sedan with tinted windows. There was no reason for me to take notice of it, except for the feeling that prickled along my skin. I kept walking, but my mind was already back inside that restaurant. Why hadn't Carla told me more? Why had she stopped herself? I tried calling her twice that morning. No answer. When I returned to the restaurant for my evening shift, it felt different. The usual noise of customers and the kitchen staff had an odd emptiness to it, like the air had been drained of all its energy. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried to focus on my tasks. And then, at the far corner of the bar, I saw him. The man, the one from the other night. His back was to me, but I recognized his silhouette, his posture, the black suit, the way he sat like he owned the space around him. But this time, something was different. He wasn't alone. Beside him, there was another man, taller, broader, with a cold smile that sent a shiver up my spine. He was talking to the man I had seen before, but I couldn't make out the conversation. Their voices were low, too low for me to eavesdrop on from across the room. But something about the way they were sitting, about the way the second man's hand occasionally rested on the first arm, didn't feel right. I thought of Carla's warning. These men weren't just customers. They weren't just rich assholes toying with people. They were something else entirely. I turned quickly, my heart pounding. The last thing I wanted was to get involved, to be drawn into whatever it was they were doing. But I couldn't stop myself. The question burned in me. What is it that they want from me? I walked toward the bar, my steps unsteady as I approached them. As I drew closer, the second man looked up, his eyes locked onto mine, cold, calculating, like he knew exactly who I was and what I was thinking. "Do you need something, miss?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. I froze, feeling the weight of the moment settle around me. I was caught between fear and defiance, between wanting to run and wanting to confront them. I didn't know how to answer, but I had to know. What the hell is going on? I, I'm just here to serve, I said, my voice shaking only slightly. The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. "Of course," he said, his gaze lingering a moment too long before he turned back to the man beside him. I felt the air crackle between us, thick with the unspoken, heavy with the knowledge that this wasn't over. I was only just beginning to understand that. And the worst part? I still had no idea what was coming next. Everything started to unravel the moment I saw Carla again. She didn't show up for work the next day, nor the day after. When I called, I was met with a cold voicemail. She'd always picked up before, always joked about how I was the only one calling her at all hours of the night. But now nothing. The unease that had settled deep in my chest morphed into full-blown anxiety. I had to know what had happened, had to understand why everything around me felt so wrong. She was the only one who had warned me, who had given me that cryptic little piece of advice about staying away from them. But I wasn't ready to let it go. I couldn't. After work one night, I went to her apartment. I'd been there a few times before, so I knew where she lived. Nothing fancy, just a modest second-floor unit on the edge of town. I knocked, waited, knocked again. Nothing. I called her phone again, pressing it to my ear, feeling my pulse quicken. The voicemail picked up again. Something inside me snapped. I had to find her. That night I drove around the city, trying to get a sense of her routine, where she might go when she wasn't at work. I didn't have a clear direction, but the desperation gnawing at me forced me forward. I found myself in an unfamiliar part of town. Quiet, dimly lit streets that felt more like a forgotten part of the city. My headlights flickered against dark buildings, the kind that didn't seem to belong to any neighborhood, the kind that you passed without thinking twice. But then I saw it, a building at the end of the block. I didn't know why it stood out, but it did. The door was ajar, a soft light spilling out into the street like a warning beacon. Something in me urged me to stop, to get out of the car, but I didn't. I stayed in the car for a long moment, watching the light flicker in the empty street, and then, without thinking, I stepped out. As I walked toward the building, my heart was thundering in my chest, each step seeming heavier than the last. The door creaked open as I pushed it gently. Inside, the space was surprisingly warm, well kept, the kind of place that felt off limits, like no one was supposed to be there. I barely had time to register the soft murmur of voices before I froze. Carla was sitting at a table across the room, but she wasn't alone. And it wasn't just anyone who was sitting across from her. It was the man, the one from the bar, the one who had made me play. But now there was something different about him. His face was relaxed, almost too relaxed, as he leaned forward in conversation. And there beside him was a woman I didn't recognize. Dark hair, sharp eyes, wearing a black leather jacket. For a moment I stood in the doorway, invisible to them as I watched the scene unfold before me. Carla's face was different. No longer the quiet, nervous smile I had grown accustomed to. Now there was something else in her eyes. Something dangerous. The man's voice was calm, cool, and it sent a shiver down my spine. You need to understand, it's not just about the music. We need you to do what's right for us. For everyone. Carla nodded, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. I'm in. I understand. Just make sure she stays out of this. She doesn't need to know. The words hit me like a punch in the gut. She doesn't need to know. She doesn't need to know. Suddenly, the pieces started to fit together in ways I hadn't expected. Carla hadn't just been warning me. She hadn't been looking out for me. She had been part of whatever this was all along. I couldn't breathe. My entire body felt like it was being crushed under the weight of the realization. I backed up slowly, as quietly as I could, but the door creaked. The sound was sharp in the still air. Carla looked up, her eyes widening in horror as she saw me standing there, frozen in shock. Lena? Her voice cracked, but the man beside her didn't seem to notice. I was already turning, stumbling back toward the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart raced as I sprinted to the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. Carla? On their side? What the hell was going on? Why had she lied to me? I felt dizzy, my mind reeling as I started the car and sped out of the alley. The streets blurred past me, the world outside turning into a smudge of colors and shapes. But I couldn't focus on that. I couldn't focus on anything but the horrible truth that was crashing through me. Carla wasn't my friend. She had been lying to me from the start. The next few days were a blur of confusion and anger. Every time I tried to get a hold of Carla, there was nothing. She'd disappeared again, as if she'd never been there in the first place. The restaurant felt suffocating, each shift a reminder of how little I truly knew. I couldn't go to the police. Not yet. I didn't have enough to go on. All I had was a sick feeling in my gut and a haunting memory of the man's cold eyes, staring at me like I was a pawn in some twisted game. But then, just as I was about to give in to the fear, something changed. I got a call. It was from an unknown number, but I answered anyway, my heart pounding in my chest. Lena, the voice said. It was low, almost a whisper. It's time for you to understand. The line went dead. The next few hours were a blur of frantic searching, digging into everything I could find about the man. The one who had made me play the piano, who had manipulated Carla, who had controlled everything from the shadows. I went through old records, anything that might connect him to the city or to any powerful organizations. And that's when I found it. The name on a document buried deep in a database. Nicholas Wolfe. A name that meant nothing to me. At first. I dug deeper, the cold realization settling in as I found page after page of articles. Nicholas Wolfe wasn't just some rich businessman. He was the heir to a multi-billion-dollar corporation, a shadow empire, dealing in everything from private security to illegal arms deals. And I had been caught in the middle of it. Carla wasn't just a waitress. She was a player, a part of his world, a world I had never even known existed. Everything I had believed about myself, about the people around me, was a lie. The next day, I tried to confront Carla. I had no choice. The questions in my head were too loud, too overwhelming. But when I showed up at her apartment, I was met with a cold silence. No answer. No sign of her. I had no choice. I was done being a pawn. I had to fight back. And that meant taking risks, going straight into the lion's den. What followed wasn't just a pursuit of the truth. It was a decision to change the game, to stop being a victim of whatever twisted manipulation I had been subjected to. I had no plan, no allies, and no clear way out. But I wasn't about to sit idly by anymore. Everything I had believed was shattered, and now I would take the fight to them. I didn't know what I was walking into. The plan had been a half-baked idea, born out of desperation and fury. I had no clue if I'd survive it, if I'd come out of it alive, or if I would finally be free. But I couldn't turn back now. Everything I had fought for, everything I had risked, my safety, my sanity, even my soul, it had all led me to this moment. And in that instant, all I could feel was fear, the kind that made my bones shake and my heart beat out of rhythm, the kind that made me question if I had made the wrong choice. But it was too late for that. I had already crossed the line. I stood in front of the building, the one I had been avoiding for days, the place that had held the answers, the lies, the secrets I had been chasing. It was taller than I remembered, its looming dark windows like eyes, watching me, daring me to walk inside. My pulse quickened as I approached the door. Every inch of my body screamed for me to turn around, to go home, to leave this madness behind. But I had no choice. I couldn't. I pushed the door open. The first thing that hit me was the cold. The temperature inside was unnaturally low, like stepping into an icebox, and my breath misted in the air. The low hum of electricity buzzed above me, but the place felt dead. No laughter, no sounds of voices. It was quiet, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was watching me. I moved through the hallway, my footsteps muffled on the thick carpet, until I reached the heavy doors, the ones that led to the heart of it all. Behind them, I knew, was the man, the one who had twisted everything, the puppet master, Nicholas Wolfe. I could feel his presence, even without seeing him. I could already hear his voice in my head, see the way his eyes had studied me like a piece of property, something he could mold, control, destroy. This was it. I didn't know if I could do this. I didn't know if I was ready, but I was already too deep to back out now. I pushed open the door, stepping into a room that was as sterile as it was intimidating. Cold metal tables lined the space, and the walls were stark white, almost blinding under the harsh fluorescent lights. In the center of the room, there was a desk, and sitting behind that desk, cool and unbothered, was Nicholas Wolfe. He didn't even look up as I entered. He simply continued scribbling on a stack of papers, as if I were no more than an annoyance. I took a step forward, the air heavy with the tension I'd carried with me for days. "I'm here," I said, my voice trembling despite myself. "We need to talk." Finally, he glanced up. His eyes met mine, calm, calculating, like he was seeing the pieces of some larger puzzle falling into place. And that look, that cold, dismissive look, almost made me falter. Almost. Instead, I took a deep breath, refusing to back down. I had come this far. "Sit down," he said, his voice smooth, casual, like he hadn't just ruined my life. "It's clear we need to have a conversation." I stood where I was. "Number, you've lied to me, and I'm not here to sit down. I'm here to make you tell me the truth." He let out a soft chuckle, his fingers still drumming on the desk. "The truth? You've been given plenty of that, Lena. Maybe more than you deserve." I clenched my fists at my sides. "You manipulated me, used me. You made me play the piano that night like it was some sort of game. What do you want from me?" For a moment, he didn't answer. He simply observed me, as though he was studying my every movement, trying to gauge how much I really knew. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he said finally, his tone shifting slightly. There was a hint of something cold and calculating behind his words now. But you've still got it all wrong. I didn't make you play because I thought it was funny, Lena. It wasn't about you at all. I felt my heart drop. What do you mean? He stood up slowly, moving toward me with deliberate steps. The space between us seemed to shrink, his presence almost suffocating. It's never been about you. You're just a pawn in something much bigger. Always have been. You're the key, Lena. The only one who can get me what I need. I stared at him, confusion mixing with fury. What are you talking about? You've been playing with me, manipulating me, and now you want me to help you? Help you do what? He smiled, a twisted, calculating smile. I need you to help me find the one who betrayed me, the one who sold me out. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. And I need you to want to help me. Because if you don't, Lena, well, you've already seen what happens when you don't follow the rules. I froze. Betrayal? Sold him out? Who was he talking about? Before I could speak, he continued, his voice lowering to a whisper. You think Carla was just a waitress, don't you? That she was just looking out for you? You couldn't have been more wrong. She was working for me all along. And you, Lena, were just a tool. The ground beneath me felt like it was falling away. Carla, I whispered, my voice cracking. Number. You're lying. Am I? He moved closer, his words cutting through the air like a blade. She was sent to keep an eye on you. The moment you played that piano, you became part of something you don't even understand. Carla was always in on it. She was always working for me. She's the one who fed me information, who made sure you followed the script. I took a step back, my mind spinning. Carla had lied to me. She had been working with him all along, betraying me from the start. The woman I had trusted, the woman who had warned me. Why? I gasped, my chest tight with rage. Why would you do this? Why me? Because you're the only one who could get close. You were the perfect candidate. A waitress with talent, with ambition. You were the perfect distraction, the perfect tool to manipulate. All I needed was for you to play your part. His words hit me like a gut punch. The betrayal, the realization that I had been nothing but a pawn in a game far too dangerous for someone like me. But something inside me shifted. The rage, the hurt. It didn't cripple me. It fueled me. I wasn't going to let him win. You think you can control me? I spat, my voice shaking with fury. You've lied to me. You've used me. But I'm not your puppet anymore. His eyes narrowed, his smile fading. For a moment I saw a flicker of something dangerous in him. Something cold and unrelenting. You don't know what you're up against, Lena. You never did. I didn't flinch. I couldn't. And then in a flash, everything changed. The door slammed open, and I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, fast, echoing through the room. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted in the dim light. It was Carla. She stood there, a gun in her hand, pointed directly at me. I couldn't breathe. Carla? I whispered, my voice trembling. What are you? Her face was a mask of cold indifference. I'm sorry, Lena, she said, her voice flat, emotionless. This is how it has to be. Before I could react, she pulled the trigger. The world went black. When I opened my eyes, everything was blurry. My head pounded and I couldn't feel my body, but I could hear the soft murmur of voices around me. Nicholas Wolf's voice. Carla's voice. You've lost, Nicholas said, his words sharp, victorious. I know, Carla replied quietly. But as my vision cleared, I realized something. The weight of the gun had been a lie. The sound had been a misdirection. I wasn't dead. I had won. The pieces were finally in place, and now I would change everything. I woke to an unbearable silence. My head throbbed, the faint echo of the gunshot still ringing in my ears, as if my brain couldn't let go of the last image. Carla, the woman I had trusted, pulling the trigger. I blinked, disoriented. The world slow to come into focus. The sterile whiteness of a room stretched out before me. The scent of antiseptic mixing with something far more unsettling. Like metal. Like blood. It took me a moment to realize I wasn't dead. I wasn't sure if that was a relief. My hands were bound to a chair. My body ached in places I couldn't remember hurting, and when I tested my legs, the sharp jolt of pain shot through me. But I was alive. For now. I took in my surroundings, another cold room, a different one, devoid of anything familiar. My eyes scanned the walls, the corners, the ceiling, and then, as if on cue, the door opened. Nicholas Wolfe stepped inside. For a moment, I didn't react. I just stared at him, trying to still the storm of emotions roiling inside me. He was the same as always, imposing, confident, unbothered. But there was something colder now, something more dangerous in the way he looked at me. "You're still alive," he said, his voice a smooth, mocking tone that made my skin crawl. "I wasn't sure you would be." I didn't respond. What was there to say? He had already told me everything about how I was just a tool in his game. He didn't care if I survived or not. He just needed me to be functional for now. He moved closer, studying me as if I were a broken toy. "Carla wasn't supposed to kill you, but she got too eager, too emotional." He chuckled, like he was the one in control of it all, like I wasn't even worth his full attention. "She thought you were more than just a pawn. She was wrong, of course." A pang of betrayal hit me again. Carla had been working with him all along. She was the one who led me into this web of lies, the one who had made me believe that she cared. But in the end, she had failed. She had meant to kill me, but she hadn't. I couldn't help but feel a bitter, hollow sort of victory. I had survived, but at what cost? "What do you want from me now?" My voice came out raw, almost like a whisper, but I forced it out. Nicholas's eyes glinted with something darker. "I don't need you anymore. You've served your purpose." He took a step back, his gaze hardening. "But you'll be useful for something else. I have no intention of letting you walk away. Not after everything you've seen." The words stung, but they weren't a surprise. I had expected this. I had known the moment I walked into that room that I would be trapped in his world forever. But there was something else. Something I had underestimated. There was still a chance. A slim one. I took a breath, trying to steady myself. "You've already lost," I said, my voice growing stronger, despite the fear clawing at me. "You've already lost, Nicholas. Everything you've built, it's crumbling, and you can't stop it." His smile faded, his eyes narrowing, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "You think I'm afraid of you?" "No." I shook my head slowly, my heart pounding with a clarity I hadn't known before. "But I think you're afraid of losing control, and that's what's going to destroy you. It always does." He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, like he was waiting for me to break down. But the truth hit me with a force that left me standing a little taller. Nicholas wasn't invincible. He was just a man who had twisted the world to fit his own selfish desires. And in the end, that kind of control was always fragile. "You don't understand," he said, his voice sharp, almost pleading. "You never understood what it takes to survive in this world." I didn't let him finish. "I understand perfectly," I said quietly, the weight of it sinking in. "It takes nothing to destroy lives, but it takes everything to rebuild them." For the first time since meeting him, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It didn't last long, but it was enough to show me that he was more fragile than I had thought. The next few hours were a blur. They were a haze of threats, attempts to break me, attempts to make me surrender. But each time, I stood firm. Every time he pressed me, I pressed back. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first walked into that damn bar. I had changed, I had learned, and now I had the one thing Nicholas would never have: clarity. And then came the moment I knew would come. Carla walked into the room. She was different now, hollow, lost in a way I couldn't even comprehend. She looked at me with a mixture of regret and resignation, her hands hanging limp at her sides. "I never wanted this," she said softly, her voice barely audible. I didn't trust her. I couldn't. But something in her eyes made me hesitate. "Then why?" I asked, my voice shaking despite myself. She swallowed hard, glancing at Nicholas, then back at me. "I was too scared to say no. I thought, I thought I could control it. I thought I could protect you from him." I couldn't process it. It wasn't enough. She wasn't enough. You should have told me, and I whispered, my throat tight. You should have told me the truth. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't say anything else. In that moment, something broke inside me. Everything I had believed in, all the relationships, all the trust I had so desperately clung to, shattered into pieces. But it wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the realization that we had all been living in a world we couldn't control, a world where power, greed, and manipulation ruled. And when it was over, when I was standing outside the building, watching as the sirens wailed in the distance, all I could think about was how everything had come full circle, how I had walked into that nightmare completely blind, and now I was walking out with nothing but scars. But there was one thing I had learned. The truth had cost me more than I ever expected, but it had also set me free. As I walked away from the building, the weight of everything hit me like a brick. I had survived, but I had lost too much in the process. And as I glanced over my shoulder, watching the shadows grow long, one thing was certain. I wasn't the same person who had walked in. But maybe, just maybe, I was someone stronger than I had ever been before. Some secrets should stay buried, but I dug too deep.